The drive from Greenville to Charleston takes a little under 3 hours, and I made it with the windows down and a box of shortbread on the passenger's seat. The kind I used to make for every staff meeting when I ran the front of house at the Bellamont. My daughter-in-law had never mentioned she disliked shortbread, so I assumed she didn't. I assumed a lot of things that morning. My son had called 2 Sundays before. Not a formal invitation, not even a real plan. Just his voice, easy and careless the way it gets when he's half watching something on television. "We're doing a little anniversary thing in Charleston on the 15th. You should probably come down, Mom. It'll be low-key." That was the whole sentence. No venue, no time, no follow-up from my daughter-in-law, who organized every detail of their lives with the precision of a magazine editorial. I should have asked more questions. I know that now. But when your child says you should come, you believe him. I packed a bag, wrapped the gift I'd been holding onto since Christmas, a framed watercolor of the harbor I'd commissioned from a local artist because they'd honeymooned on the coast, and I drove. I texted my daughter-in-law from a gas station outside of Walterboro. "Hey, just a few hours out. What time should I plan for tonight?" I watched the message sit there, delivered, unread. I filled my tank, bought a bottle of water, and got back on the highway. By the time I reached the outskirts of Charleston, I'd gotten nothing back. I pulled into the parking lot of the B&B I'd booked on East Bay Street and checked my phone again. Nothing from her. But I opened Instagram, something I rarely do, and there she was. A story she'd posted 40 minutes ago. A close-up of a mimosa on a rattan table, pale and gold and perfect. The caption read details, with a small location tag I recognized immediately. The Harwell House. I sat in the parking lot for a moment with my hands still on the wheel. I know the Harwell House the way you know a building you've walked through 400 times. I know which window looks out over the garden, which floorboard in the main hallway has a soft spot, which vendor the events team calls first when the original falls through. I'd consulted there for 2 years after I retired from the Bellamont. I had trained their current events director, a sharp young woman named Delia. Back when she was an assistant who wrote everything down in a green spiral notebook and stayed an hour late every Friday to ask me questions. I checked in at the B&B, hung up my dress, and set the watercolor against the wall. Then I texted my son directly, "What time and where tonight?" He responded in 4 minutes. "Harwell House 7, see you there." Just a time and a smiley face, nothing else. I smoothed my dress. Ivory linen, something I'd worn to restaurant openings and gallery nights, and told myself it was enough. The invitation wasn't formal, but the love was real. That's what I told myself. The Harwell House glowed at 7 o'clock. The garden lights were strung low over the courtyard, the kind of warm amber that costs money to look that effortless. A young woman at the entry desk smiled and asked for my name. I told her. She looked down at her tablet. "I'm not finding you on tonight's list," she said, tilting the screen slightly, as though a better angle might produce my name. "It's a private reservation for the Callaway party." I looked past her. They were already seated. My daughter-in-law in a white wrap dress, her hair loose the way she wore it in photographs. Her mother on one side, her 2 sisters across from her. 3 women I recognized from the wedding, 2 I didn't. My son at the far end in the blue linen shirt I'd given him last Father's Day. I counted. 12 chairs, 12 people already in them. "I'll just let them know I'm here," I said. My son looked up when I was halfway across the courtyard. His expression did something complicated. Not surprise exactly. More like the face of a man who had been caught not doing something he knew he should have done. "Mom," he stood. I gave him credit for that much. My daughter-in-law did not stand. She lifted her wine glass in a small wave, the kind that means hello and goodbye in the same motion. "Oh, Nadine." A light laugh, the effortless kind she practiced. "We honestly didn't think you'd make the whole drive down. It's such a haul from Greenville." She glanced around the table with the smallest shrug. "We're kind of at capacity tonight anyway." Kind of at capacity. 12 chairs. 12 bodies already in them. Not even the thought of a 13th. Not a folding chair pulled from a corner. Not a single person at that table who moved to make room or looked at her to suggest they should. One of her sisters looked into her wine glass, Her mother rearranged her napkin. The two friends I didn't know studied the menu cards. No one spoke. I set the wrapped watercolor on the edge of the nearest surface, a sideboard near the garden entrance, and I looked at my son. He looked back at me, his mouth opened slightly. I waited one beat to see what kind of man he would choose to be in that particular second. He sat back down. "Happy anniversary," I said to both of them, and I walked back through the amber light the way I'd come. My car was still warm from the drive. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time without turning the engine on. After 31 years in hotel management, I have one rule I've kept without exception. Never make a decision in the first 10 minutes of anger. I made that rule in 2003 after a difficult incident at the Bellamont involving a senator's aide who berated my front desk staff. I wanted to pull his reservation on the spot. Instead, I waited, I thought. Then I acted precisely and without noise. I waited 10 minutes in that parking lot, watching the lights of the garden flicker through the iron fence. Then I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called since before my husband Gordon passed. Delia, the green notebook girl. The one I'd trained and mentored and written 3 recommendation letters for, the last one addressed to the Harwell house itself. She answered on the second ring. "Delia," I said, "is my legacy access still active in Meridian?" A pause, a small one. Then, "I meant to clean up the account after Mr. Westcott passed. I never got to it. It's still there." "That's all I needed to know," I said. "Thank you, sweetheart." I hung up and drove back to my B&B. I am not a vindictive woman, and I want to be clear about that before I tell you what I did next, because the difference matters. Vindictive women act from rage. What I did came from somewhere quieter and more deliberate. 30 years of managing difficult situations had taught me that the loudest response is almost never the most effective one. In my room, I opened my laptop and logged into the Meridian Events platform with credentials I hadn't used in over a year. The system loaded without hesitation. My name still sat there. N. Westcott, Senior Advisor Legacy Contact, active. I navigated to upcoming events and found it without trouble. Callaway First Anniversary Brunch, Sunday, June 16th, 9 a.m., the Harwell House Garden Room. The full event, not the dinner, that was apparently just the opening act. The brunch was the main performance. 25 guests, a champagne service, a florist, a live guitarist. A catered spread from a local chef I recognized immediately. A young woman I'd met at a hospitality workshop in Asheville 4 years ago, someone I'd written a lengthy recommendation for when she applied to a culinary residency in Charlotte. All the vendors were contacts I had introduced to the Harwell house during my consulting years, every single one. I read through the booking notes the way I used to read event briefs, carefully, looking for the seams. And then, in the floral specifications section, I found something my daughter-in-law had typed in herself. No chrysanthemums under any circumstances. They read as funeral flowers, and anyone who books them has no understanding of occasion design. Blush peonies only. Juliet variety, 60 centimeter stems, low arrangement. I read that twice, then I read it a third time. I pulled up the vendor communication field, the one still accessible under my legacy coordinator status, and added a single line. Per coordination protocol, all vendor questions to route through N. Westcott. Timing adjustment confirmed. Vendor load-in window shifted to 10 a.m. per venue request. Then I picked up my phone. I called Beaumont Blooms and spoke to the woman who manages their weekend line. I explained there was a substitution situation. The blush peonies had been shorted by their primary supplier. I'd personally confirmed that white chrysanthemums in the same volume were available through their backup wholesaler, and I was handling the client communication myself. She hesitated. "The notes say absolutely no chrysanthemums." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm calling directly rather than leaving it in the system. We're managing it." 30 years of saying "we're managing it" had taught me that the phrase closes more questions than it opens. She confirmed the substitution. I called the guitarist next. There had been a scheduling conflict with an early morning event in the garden room, I explained, and his arrival window had shifted to 10:15. He was gracious. He had a late gig the night before and was glad for the extra hour. The caterer I did not call. She was young and building her name, and I had no interest in putting her in a difficult position. I updated her load-in window in the system notes to 10 o'clock. She would see it in the morning. Food would arrive when food arrived. I closed the laptop and looked at the watercolor still leaning against the wall, still wrapped in its brown paper. I thought about my husband, who spent 38 years in this industry, who started as a bellman in Charlotte at 19 and worked his way to regional operations through nothing but patience and precision, who used to say when I came home frustrated from a poorly managed event, "The people who cause problems in hospitality always forget that the people who run it know exactly how everything works." He was right about that, as he was right about most things. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the way I used to feel after navigating a genuinely hard situation at work, tired but clear, like I'd done exactly what the moment required and nothing beyond it. I turned off the light and went to sleep. I drove home to Greenville the next morning. I didn't go to the brunch. I didn't need to be there. What I know about hospitality events is this: the first 30 minutes determine everything that follows. If the flowers aren't in place when the first guest arrives, no amount of recovery changes that initial impression. If the music hasn't started, the silence does its own communicating. If the food is late, even 40 minutes, people stop experiencing the occasion and start waiting for it to be over. I found out later, through a food and travel writer who had been invited and posted a brief, carefully worded observation to her subscriber newsletter, that the garden room was not ready when the first guests arrived at 9. That the florist came late with white chrysanthemums, arranged beautifully, which somehow made it worse. That the guitarist arrived while people were already on their second cup of coffee. That the food, when it finally came, arrived cold. The writer didn't name anyone. She didn't need to. Her closing line was, "Sometimes a beautiful setting is the only thing holding an event together, and sometimes that's not quite enough." My daughter-in-law went quiet on social media for 10 days after that. My son did not call. I went about my life. The card arrived on a Tuesday, nearly 3 weeks later. Pale green envelope. My daughter-in-law's handwriting, careful and rounded like she'd been practicing. Inside, an anniversary thank you card with a printed message about cherished memories and gratitude. She had written 2 lines in the blank space at the bottom. "Thank you for the watercolor. We've hung it in the guest room." The guest room, the room nobody actually sits in. I read the card twice. Then I set it on the kitchen counter next to my coffee cup and stood there listening to my house. No mention of the brunch. No mention of the flowers, or the timing, or the cold food, or what any of it might have meant. Just 2 lines about the watercolor in the room where they put things they didn't know what else to do with. I laughed. It started as a small laugh and became a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere unexpected, from a thing finally becoming clear instead of painful. Then I went to my desk and pulled out the folder I'd been quietly building since February. Gordon left behind a modest but careful estate, the house, a retirement account, and a separate investment portfolio he'd built over decades by saying no to things that didn't matter. My son had never asked directly about any of it, but he'd made comments, in the offhand way people make comments they want you to absorb without holding them accountable for saying. When things eventually come down, we could finally do that kitchen renovation. Or, Dad always believed in keeping things in the family, said with a smile, as if the sentence meant whatever he needed it to mean in that particular moment. Gordon never said that. What Gordon said was, put your resources where they do something real, not where they're merely expected. In February, I had sat down with our family attorney and a financial advisor. In April, I filed the paperwork for the Westcott Hospitality Fund, a small private foundation established in my husband's name to support women over 50 entering or re-entering careers in the hospitality industry. Scholarships for professional coursework, stipends for apprenticeships, a mentorship network built from 30 years of connections I'd made and kept. My son's name did not appear anywhere in the documentation, not as beneficiary, not as trustee, not as anything. He didn't know. He had never asked. He'd simply assumed, the comfortable way people assume things they've never had to earn, as though time itself were a form of entitlement, as though proximity to someone who built something was the same as building it yourself. Let the attorneys explain it to him when the time comes. That's what attorneys are for. The first cohort of the Westcott Hospitality Fund gathered for their closing dinner on a Thursday evening in September in a small event room at a culinary arts center in Greenville that a former colleague let me use without charge. 7 women. 6 months of curriculum I had built from scratch. Operations, event planning, vendor management, customer service, the practical logistics of turning a skill into a livelihood. They had told me 2 weeks before that they were planning something. They asked me one thing only: please just come and let us do everything. I didn't argue. When I walked in that evening, the room smelled like roasted garlic and something sweet. A peach cobbler, I learned later, made from fruit someone had grown in her own backyard. The tables had been pushed together into one long surface covered in tablecloths that didn't quite match. Ivory, pale yellow, one that was clearly a repurposed flat sheet someone had ironed carefully and thought was good enough, which it absolutely was. The center was lined with mason jars of wildflowers, black-eyed Susans and Queen Anne's lace, and one stem of purple, something none of them could identify. They'd cut them from a field on the way over. No chrysanthemums. At the head of the table, a card with my name in careful block letters. Below it, in smaller writing, the woman who showed up for us. I stopped in the doorway. The woman who had taught 4th grade for 22 years and was now 3 months into running a jam and preserves business from her home kitchen came and took my arm and walked me to my chair. She had cried in our 3rd session when I told the group that 58 was not too late to start over. She had printed out those session notes and had them laminated. "We've got it from here," she said. "Tonight you just sit." So I sat. For the first time in longer than I could measure, I sat at a table that someone else had set, and I let other people bring me things. The woman who wanted to open a bed and breakfast served the first course, a chilled cucumber soup she had practiced 4 times at home. The grandmother who had just passed her food handler's certification plated the main, a roasted chicken with herbs grown in containers on her apartment balcony. Someone poured the wine. Someone lit the candles. They moved around each other in that small room with the easy, unhurried confidence of people who had learned, together, to trust what they could do. When everyone was seated, the school teacher stood and raised her glass. "To the woman," she said, "who reminded us that a seat at the table is not something you wait around to be given." The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when something true has been said. 7 women looking at me. 7 women who had shown up every week for 6 months, who had turned in assignments and asked hard questions and stayed late to practice things they were afraid to get wrong. I thought about the courtyard at the Harwell house, about standing in the amber light with a wrapped painting in my hands and nowhere to put myself, about the drive home on Route 26 with the windows down and the radio off, just the sound of the road and my own thoughts for 3 hours. I thought about every table I'd arranged in 31 years of work, every centerpiece placed, every floor plan drafted, every 5:30 a.m. vendor call made so that an event would feel effortless at 7 in the evening. Every room I had stood at the edge of, making sure the people inside it felt seen and welcomed, and worth the trouble of all the invisible work. I had spent decades building seats for other people and had somehow, somewhere along the way, forgotten to save one for myself. Or perhaps I had been taught to forget, taught that staying quiet was the same as keeping peace, that making myself small was the same as being gracious, that a folding chair produced at the last minute, or no chair at all, was something a woman of good character learned to accept without comment. I raised my glass. "They didn't leave a place for me," I said, and my voice was steady. "So I built a table." The room went loud with something that sounded like recognition. Laughter and glass touching and one woman saying yes under her breath, the way you say yes when an answer finally matches the question you've been carrying. We ate until the cobbler was finished and talked until past 10. I listened to a woman describe, with her hands moving fast and her voice full of disbelief at herself, how she had landed her first corporate catering inquiry the week before. I listened to another explain how she had negotiated her first vendor contract and come out better than she expected. I gave feedback when they asked and stayed quiet when they didn't need me to say anything. Later, after the dishes were washed and the tablecloths folded and the mason jars rinsed and left on the counter, because nobody could quite bring themselves to throw away the last of the wildflowers, I walked to my car through a parking lot lit by a single overhead light. The September air was cool, cicadas somewhere beyond the tree line. I thought about something I had said to my son once when he was 12 and came home upset because a group of boys hadn't let him sit with them at lunch. I had told him, "Baby, any table that doesn't want you at it isn't worth the chair." He had rolled his eyes because he was 12 and I was his mother, and nothing I said landed correctly at that age. I hope he remembers it now. For my part, I had spent too many years forgetting my own advice, showing up where I wasn't expected, staying quiet to preserve a peace that was never actually peaceful, folding myself to fit into spaces that had never been built with me in mind. That was finished. I had a foundation to run, a second cohort starting in January, and a table I had built with my own hands, long enough for every woman who needed a place to land, and always, at the head of it, one chair with my name already on it. That's the only reservation worth keeping, the one you make for yourself.